The next item of business this afternoon is topical questions. Question number 1, Claire Baker.
To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on its 2011 climate change target. Thank you.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Official statistics on emissions of greenhouse gases in Scotland were published on 7th June 2013. Unadjusted figures show that Scotland's direct emissions fell by 9.9% between 2010 and 2011, and that this was the largest year-on-year decrease since records began in 1998. However, once the effect of emissions trading is factored in, the net Scottish emissions account only fell by 2.9%. The result is that Scotland's statutory climate change target for 2011, which is expressed as an absolute figure in tonnes and which was set based on Parliament's understanding of Scotland's baseline emissions at the time, has been missed by 0.848 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent. Scottish Ministers plan to publish the finalised second climate change report on proposals and policies, or RPP, later this month. This report will set out how the Scottish Government intends to meet our targets to 2027 and will show how we can compensate for the excess emissions in 2010 and 2011 over the long term. It is worth bearing in mind that since 1990, Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions have fallen by 21.59 megatonnes of CO2 equivalent. This equates to more than the total 2011 emissions of Northern Ireland of 20.42 megatonnes.
Claire Baker.
The failure to meet the second emissions target is deeply disappointing, but perhaps not surprising. 2010's target was dismissed as being due to cold winter. 2011's been spun as a complicated data change. The Minister says we're still on target for 2020, but the adjusted baseline from 2010 data makes the target more difficult. We're relying on circumstances rather than firm policy and leadership. Over the last 48 hours, the Ministers received a volume of messages calling for improvements to RPP2. Will the revised RPP2 clearly demonstrate which policies have been introduced to compensate for the annual missed targets?
Minister.
As I explained to the member in my answer, the RPP2 will look at how we address the shortfall in abatement that's taken place in 2011 and recouping that in the long term. As the member will appreciate, we've had about a week since the data was first notified to Government and obviously published on Friday. The process of preparing RPP2 has been a lengthy one. It's gone through parliamentary consultation. We will do what we can to adopt the figures that have been published on last Friday in the new document, which will be published later this month, on the 27th of June, in fact. And I hope that that will set out a path which will set Scotland fair in terms of achieving our target. But it's worth pointing out that as at 2011, we were expecting to have a fall of 23.9% in emissions to this date. We've actually achieved 25.7%. And Claire Baker, I hope would recognise that the baseline having moved by 1.2 megatonnes, that has made the task of achieving a fixed target more difficult.
Claire Baker.
In scrutiny of RPP2, the Parliamentary Committee's confirmed Stop Climate Chaos' analysis that will only meet all our annual targets if all the policies and all the proposals are implemented and the EU increases its emissions target to 30%. Will the revised RPP2 address the reliance on the EU emissions target? And under the Climate Change Act, the Scottish Government must give a formal report when an annual target is missed. The report on 2010 was wrapped up into RPP2. Will there be a formal report on the 2011 target, or will this just be wrapped up? It's not really good enough to include the formal report within a report that's the RPP2 when that's due within a week.
Minister.
Claire Baker ought to realise that there was actually a separate document produced which explains how we've missed the target in 2010, and a similar format will be produced again in 2011. The RPP2 document which she refers has obviously had the opportunity, because of the timescales involved, to look at how we address our emissions targets in the longer term. Claire Baker is incorrect in assuming that it's only in the circumstances where the EU moves to 30% that we can achieve a 42% reduction in our climate emissions. We can achieve 42%, as we've shown in the RPP2, if this government implements its policies and proposals in absence of a EU move to 30%. So we are making great strides to ensure that through domestic effort we can achieve our targets and not just relying on the EU. Clearly, if the EU does move to 30%, that task becomes a lot easier, and we would have a very substantial overshoot in terms of abatement of the order of 18 megatonnes by the end of 2027.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful that the Minister hasn't used the phrase world-leading so far in this exchange, but I do think it's regrettable that he hasn't used the word sorry. Can I ask him what actions he thinks he should have taken that would have allowed us to reach the target last year and this year. Where is it? In which policy areas that the government hasn't been doing well enough?
Minister.
Well, as the member knows, that we're referring to figures in 2011, so it's not last year or the year before, it's the year before that, in fact, we're talking about. As the member knows, all sections, I'm sure he's looked at the figures in some detail, knowing Patrick Harvey reasonably well, although I've only been in this Parliament a short time. All sectors of the economy are now making a progress in terms of transport is now lower than in 1990 if you exclude international aviation and shipping. And so we now have a position where all sectors are making a contribution. Clearly, we want to do more. And as I set out in RPP2, the draft RPP2, we're aware that transport and residential emissions are areas that have further to go. But this government is doing all it can and making substantial investments to achieve those targets. What would be nice, I think, for the maturity of the debate is if there's a recognition of just how challenging these targets are. They are world-leading targets. And this Parliament has shown greater ambition than any other nation on this world. It would be nice to see other members of this chamber showing some concern for the fact that we are trying to achieve the most ambitious targets in the world and recognising that we have to do that together.
Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is the Minister aware that the climate change legislation law, which this Parliament passed, says Scottish ministers must ensure that the net Scottish emissions account for each year in that period does not exceed the target set for that year? Given the law has now been broken for the second year, what is the point of the law and who's taking account for it?
Minister.
Well, I hope that Tavish Scott would take some comfort. I appreciate the point he's making. Absolute targets have been missed, and I fully recognise that. But we do need to take some confidence from the fact that percentage changes are happening faster than was originally assumed when the targets were set, based on old data, the old methodology. So in terms of the 2009 Act and the targets that came from it, there was obviously, with the benefit of hindsight, a misunderstanding about the scale of emissions that were currently present in Scotland at that time, and indeed in 1990. So we do have to take into account that the goalposts have to some extent shifted, and we still have to achieve an absolute target. We are striving to achieve those absolute targets irrespective of the fact that the task has become more difficult. I would hope the member would join us in trying to achieve that. And I would just highlight to all the opposition parties here, with the possible exception of Greens, who I do acknowledge have some policies which not necessarily agree with 100%, but have made clear what alternative investments they would make. Other parties have not come forward with alternative costed plans in alternatives to the RPP2. And there's a complete dearth of information from the Labour Party, from the Conservative Party or the Liberal Democrats about what they will try and do instead.
Claudia Beamish.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I beg to differ with the Minister about a dearth of policies from Scottish Labour, who's put forward quite a range of issues around both transport and also housing in relation to energy efficiency.
I do need a
not least the
question.
budget. If we are to meet our future targets, transport is indeed a key area, but with a reduction of only 0.2% between 2010 and 2011, we're not seeing the progress needed. And the Rural Affairs Committee highlighted that at our scrutiny stage, concerns were raised over the wishful thinking of the abatement figures. How will this be specifically addressed in the redraft, please?
Minister.
Well, Claudia Beamish is, I believe, incorrect. I need to look at the figure, but I think it's more than a 2% drop in transport emissions between 2000 and 2011. 2010, 2011. The overall decrease is quite right between 1990 and 2011 is 0.2%. But in terms of the RPP2 that we are preparing this month, we hope to be able to demonstrate that we can achieve our long-term targets of 42% reduction by 2020. It's not correct, as some people assume, that the 42% needs to be across every sector. In an ideal world, that would be possible. But we can only take the economy and the public with us as fast as they can go in a reasonable scale. And it's worth bearing in mind that the Committee on Climate Change, when they set the annual targets, set them out in the context of what they thought was reasonably possible for a country of this size to achieve in the event the EU did move to 30%. So the fact we are continuing to press for that target, in light of the fact that the EU may not move as far as we'd like them to do, shows this government's commitment to achieving our climate change targets.
Thank you. Question number 2, Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what impact the new system for Disability-living-allowance will have on poverty in Scotland.
Minister Margaret Burgess.
Analysis by Inclusion Scotland estimates that the changes from Disability-living-allowance to personal independence payment together with a real terms cut in the budget, will significantly reduce the number of people in receipt of disability benefits in Scotland. Those changes, along with other coalition welfare cuts, will have a significant and detrimental impact on poverty in Scotland and will undermine our efforts to tackle its causes. The solution for this is for the Scottish Parliament to have control over its own welfare matters so that we can devise policies for the benefit of the Scottish people.
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you. Is the Minister aware that despite government expenditure and revenue Scotland showing that spending on social protection as a share of GDP is estimated to have been lower in Scotland than in the rest of the UK in each of the past 5 years, practitioners such as Capability Scotland are warning that the changeover to PIP could have a catastrophic effect on the Scottish economy whilst hitting the most vulnerable in our society.
Minister.
The Scottish Government analysis published earlier this year estimate that the UK Government's welfare reforms, which includes the changes from DLA to PIP, could potentially reduce welfare expenditure in Scotland by up to £4.5 billion in the 5 years to 2014-15. And today we published the Expert Working Group on Welfare's report and the Scottish Government's response to it. In our response, we mentioned Scotland's balance sheet, a report we published in April, which highlights that expenditure on social protection as a share of GDP is estimated to have been lower in Scotland than in the UK in each of the past 5 years. So the Scottish Government is aware of that fact, and we are also aware that we only have powers to mitigate and not to change. Mitigating the full impacts of these cuts will not be possible until the Scottish Parliament has full control and can put in place policies which benefit the people of Scotland.
Linda Fabiani.
Thank you. Is the Minister also aware of the worrying evidence that the Welfare Reform Committee have been hearing during open sessions with those already directly affected by the welfare reform cuts, and that work capability assessments are not fit for purpose, as shown by the number of successful appeals, and causing great stress to those who are already dealing with the effects of ill health? Does the Minister share my concern that such bad practice has now been further extended to those on disability allowance?
Minister.
Certainly share the member's concern, and I'm very much aware of the cases and the stories that the Welfare Reform Committee have been hearing, which is a concern to all of us. But we know that the work capability assessments are causing a great deal of distress to many people, and lessons have to be learned from a process which has been carried out at the moment by ATOS, but it is a flawed process and has been flawed for some considerable time. The UK Government must ensure that they take the necessary steps to make the PIP assessment a fair and effective process for all, and the Scottish Government will continue to monitor the implementation of PIP in Scotland, because we are also extremely concerned about the anxiety that people are facing at the moment. And it's been not just the Welfare Reform Committee is hearing about this, I think every MSP is hearing about it in their surgeries.
Thank you. That concludes topical questions, and we now move to the next item of business, which is a statement by Richard Lockhead on an update on the reform of